In the small mountain town of Cedar Ridge, where everyone knew everyone's business, Sarah Mitchell had always been the girl who dared to dream beyond the valley walls. But on that cold Tuesday morning in November 2019, when she walked into the recruitment office wearing her grandmother's old military jacket and asked to join the most elite special forces unit in the country, even the seasoned officers couldn't hide their smirks. "Ma'am, with all due respect," Sergeant Rodriguez had said, barely containing his laughter, "the Black Talon unit doesn't just take applications. They scout talent from the top 1% of military personnel who've already proven themselves in combat." The other recruits in the waiting room exchanged glances and whispered among themselves. Here was a 22-year-old small-town girl with no military experience, asking to join a unit so secretive that most people didn't even know existed. The audacity was almost comical. But Sarah didn't flinch. She stood there, her green eyes steady and determined, waiting for something that would change everything. Then the back door opened, and General Marcus Webb stepped out of his office. He was a man whose mere presence commanded respect, silver-haired, battle-scarred, with ribbons on his chest that told stories of conflicts most people only read about in history books. The room fell silent. The general's eyes swept across the waiting area until they landed on Sarah. For a moment that seemed to stretch forever, he studied her face. Then his gaze dropped to the faded military jacket she wore, and something in his expression shifted. He walked closer, his boots echoing in the now silent room. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but every person there heard him clearly. "Black Talon Mark." The words hung in the air like a spell. Sergeant Rodriguez's face went pale. The other recruits stopped their whispering entirely. And Sarah Mitchell, the girl they had all been laughing at just moments before, finally understood why her grandmother had made her promise to wear that old jacket on the most important day of her life. Sarah Mitchell had grown up hearing stories about her grandmother Eleanor, but she never imagined those stories were anything more than family folklore. Eleanor had died when Sarah was only 12, leaving behind boxes of old photographs, military medals that seemed too important for someone Sarah remembered as just a sweet old lady who made incredible apple pie, and that olive green military jacket that hung in the back of the hallway closet like a forgotten memory. Cedar Ridge was the kind of town where nothing much happened. Nestled between two mountain ranges in Colorado, it had one main street, two gas stations, a diner that served the best breakfast for 50 miles, and about 3,000 people who all seemed content to live their entire lives within the same 20-square-mile area. Sarah's parents owned the local hardware store, and everyone expected her to take it over someday, maybe marry Tommy Henderson from the auto shop, and raise kids who would do the same thing their parents and grandparents had done. But Sarah had always felt different. Even as a child, she would climb the tallest pine tree behind their house and stare out at the world beyond the mountains, wondering what adventures waited out there. In high school, while her classmates talked about prom dates and college parties, Sarah spent her free time at the library reading military history books and biographies of war heroes. She joined the ROTC program, much to her parents' confusion, and excelled in every physical challenge they gave her. Her mother, Linda, worried constantly. "Honey, you don't need to prove anything to anyone," she would say while watching Sarah do push-ups in the backyard at 6 in the morning. "There are plenty of good jobs right here in town." Her father, Bill, was more supportive but equally puzzled. "If you want to serve your country, that's honorable," he would tell her. "But maybe consider the Air Force or Navy. Something safer." Sarah tried to explain the feeling that burned inside her chest, the sense that she was meant for something bigger, something that would test every limit she had. But how could she make them understand when she didn't fully understand it herself? The turning point came on her 22nd birthday, when her mother finally decided to clean out Eleanor's old room. They had been putting it off for years, keeping everything exactly as it was when Eleanor passed away. Linda had always said she wasn't ready, but Sarah suspected her mother knew there were secrets in that room that might change everything. They started with the dresser drawers, finding old jewelry, faded letters, and photographs of Eleanor as a young woman. Sarah was struck by how much they looked alike. The same determined green eyes, the same stubborn set to their jaws, the same way they both tilted their heads when they were thinking hard about something. In the bottom drawer, wrapped in tissue paper that had turned yellow with age, they found a leather-bound journal. Sarah opened it carefully, afraid the old pages might crumble in her hands. The first entry was dated March 15th, 1943, and written in Eleanor's careful script. Today, I shipped out for basic training. Mom cried when I left, but she doesn't understand. This war isn't going to win itself, and I'll be damned if I'm going to sit at home knitting socks when I could be doing something that actually matters. The other girls in my unit think I'm crazy for volunteering for the Special Assignment Program. They say it's too dangerous, that women shouldn't be doing that kind of work. But I have a feeling I was born for this. Sarah's hands trembled as she turned the pages. Entry after entry revealed a woman who was nothing like the grandmother she remembered. Eleanor had been a spy during World War II, working behind enemy lines in occupied France. She had parachuted into Nazi territory, coordinated with the French resistance, and gathered intelligence that helped plan D-Day. The sweet old lady who had taught Sarah how to bake cookies had once killed 3 German soldiers with nothing but a knife and her bare hands to protect a group of Jewish children she was helping escape to safety. But the most shocking discovery came near the end of the journal. In an entry dated August 12, 1944, Eleanor wrote about receiving a special commendation from a unit so classified that she couldn't even write their real name in her private diary. She called them the Shadows and mentioned that their leader had given her a mark of honor that she would carry for the rest of her life. He told me that someday, if anyone in my family ever proved worthy, this mark would open doors that seemed impossible to open. Eleanor had written, I pray that day never comes, because it would mean the world needs warriors again. But if it does, I hope my granddaughter has the strength to carry on what I started. Sarah looked up at her mother, who was reading over her shoulder with tears streaming down her face. Mom, did you know any of this? Linda shook her head slowly. She never talked about the war. Whenever anyone asked, she would just say she did her duty and change the subject. I thought she was a secretary or something administrative. They found more evidence in a shoebox hidden behind the winter coats. Photographs of Eleanor in military uniform, standing next to people whose faces had been deliberately obscured. Documents with heavy black redactions that left only fragments of sentences visible. And finally, a small metal pin shaped like a blackbird with its wings spread, attached to a chain that had worn smooth from years of handling. Sarah picked up the pin and felt an immediate connection to it, as if it had been waiting for her all these years. The metal was heavier than it looked, and there were tiny engravings on the back that she couldn't quite make out. When she held it up to the light, she could see the faint outline of what might have been letters or numbers, but they were too worn to read clearly. Her mother watched her examine the pin with a worried expression. Sarah, I know what you're thinking, but your grandmother's war is over. You don't have to follow in her footsteps. But Sarah was already making plans. She had applied to several branches of the military over the past year, but every rejection letter said the same thing. They were looking for candidates with more experience, more training, more everything than a small-town girl could offer. She had started to believe that maybe everyone was right. Maybe she was dreaming too big. Now, holding her grandmother's secret in her hands, she felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't just about proving herself anymore. This was about finishing something that Eleanor had started, about honoring a legacy she never knew existed. That night, Sarah did research until her eyes burned from staring at the computer screen. She read everything she could find about special operations units, classified military programs, and elite forces that operated in the shadows. Most of the information was speculation and rumor, but one name kept appearing in the darkest corners of military forums and conspiracy theory websites: Black Talon. According to the whispered stories, Black Talon was a unit that didn't officially exist. They recruited from within the military, choosing only the most exceptional soldiers who had already proven themselves in impossible situations. They handled missions that were too sensitive for regular special forces, operations that would never appear in any official report. Some people claimed they were just a myth, a story that bored soldiers told to make their own work seem more interesting. But Sarah remembered her grandmother's journal entry about the shadows and their leader who gave out marks of honor. She looked again at the blackbird pin, and this time she noticed something she had missed before. When she turned it just right in the lamplight, she could see that it wasn't just a bird. It was specifically a falcon, and its talons were extended as if it was diving toward prey. The next morning, Sarah drove to the military recruitment office in the county seat, 2 hours away from Cedar Ridge. She had been there 3 times before, and each time she had left feeling smaller and more defeated. But this time was different. She wore her grandmother's old military jacket, even though it was a bit too big for her and clearly decades out of style. The black falcon pin was attached to the inside pocket, hidden but present. The recruitment office was busy that Tuesday morning, full of young men and women who looked like they had stepped out of fitness magazines. Sarah fell out of place among them, but she forced herself to walk up to the reception desk where Sergeant Rodriguez was processing applications. He looked up at her with barely concealed impatience. "Ma'am, if you're here to ask about officer candidate school again, I told you last month that your application was denied. You need to gain some real-world experience first." Sarah took a deep breath. "I'm not here about OCS. I want to apply for Black Talon." The room didn't go completely silent, but the conversations around her definitely got quieter. Sergeant Rodriguez blinked twice, as if he wasn't sure he had heard her correctly. "Ma'am, I'm not sure what you think you know about special operations, but I know that Black Talon is a classified unit that recruits from within the military," Sarah interrupted, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I know they handle missions that regular special forces can't or won't take. And I know that my grandmother served with honor in a unit that worked with them during World War II." Sergeant Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, and Sarah could see him trying to decide whether to laugh at her or be concerned about her mental state. "Ma'am, with all due respect, the Black Talon unit doesn't just take applications. They scout talent from the top 1% of military personnel who've already proven themselves in combat. What you're asking is like walking into NASA and asking to be an astronaut because your grandmother liked looking at stars." The other recruits were definitely listening now, and Sarah could hear some of them snickering. Her face burned with embarrassment, but she stood her ground. Eleanor hadn't backed down when everyone told her that women couldn't be spies, and Sarah wasn't going to back down now. "I understand that it's unusual," she said, her voice getting stronger with each word. "But I believe I have something that might change your mind." Before Sergeant Rodriguez could respond, the back door of the office opened, and General Marcus Webb stepped out. Sarah had never seen a real general before, but she knew immediately that's what he was. Everything about him commanded respect. His perfectly pressed uniform, his straight posture, the way every other person in the room automatically straightened their own posture when he appeared. His eyes swept across the room, taking in the scene with the practiced assessment of someone who had made life-in-death decisions in combat zones around the world. When his gaze landed on Sarah, she felt like he was seeing right through her, reading her history and her intentions in a single glance. Then his eyes moved to the jacket she was wearing, and something changed in his expression. It was subtle, just a slight tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible shift in how he held his shoulders. But Sarah saw it, and somehow she knew that this was the moment her grandmother had been preparing her for all those years ago. General Webb walked toward her slowly, his boots clicking on the tile floor. The room was completely quiet now, as if everyone was holding their breath. When he stopped in front of her, Sarah could smell his aftershave and see the individual ribbons on his chest, each one representing a campaign or conflict that most people only knew from history books. He studied her face for what felt like an eternity, then looked again at the jacket. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet that Sarah had to strain to hear him, but somehow his words carried to every corner of the room. Black Talon Mark. And just like that, everything changed. The silence that followed General Webb's words was so complete that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Sergeant Rodriguez looked like he had seen a ghost, his face drained of all color as he stared at the general with obvious confusion and growing concern. The other recruits seemed frozen in place, unsure whether they should continue breathing or risk making noise that might break whatever spell had just been cast over the room. General Webb extended his hand towards Sarah, palm up, in a gesture that somehow conveyed both authority and invitation. "May I see it?" Sarah knew exactly what he meant. With trembling fingers, she reached into the inner pocket of her grandmother's jacket and pulled out the black falcon pin. The metal felt warm against her palm, as if it had been absorbing heat from her body, storing energy for this exact moment. The general took the pin carefully, handling it like it was made of the most delicate crystal instead of worn military metal. He examined it closely, turning it over in his hands and running his thumb across the engravings that Sarah had barely been able to make out. When he found what he was looking for on the back, his entire demeanor shifted. The professional mask he wore slipped just enough for Sarah to see something she didn't expect: respect, tinged with what might have been sadness. "Eleanor Mitchell," he said quietly, reading from the pin. "Operative designation, Echo 7. I haven't seen one of these in 30 years. He looked up at Sarah with new eyes, as if he was seeing her not just as the young woman standing before him, but as the continuation of a story that began long before she was born. "She was your grandmother?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. "I found her journal last week. I never knew about any of it until then." General Webb handed the pin back to her, but his fingers lingered for a moment, as if he was reluctant to let go of this connection to the past. "Eleanor Mitchell was one of the finest operatives I ever had the privilege of working with. She saved more lives than anyone will ever know, and she did it without asking for recognition or reward. The fact that she never told you about her service says everything you need to know about her character." Sergeant Rodriguez finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than his usual confident tone. "Sir, I don't understand what's happening here." The general turned to him with the patient expression of someone explaining something to a child. "Sergeant, what you're looking at is a black Talon Mark of honor. During World War II, we established a tradition for our civilian assets who performed above and beyond the call of duty. These pins were given to operatives who risked their lives for missions that officially never happened. More importantly, they came with a promise that if anyone in their bloodline ever proved worthy, they would be given the opportunity to serve in ways that normal recruitment channels couldn't provide." He looked back at Sarah, and she could see him making calculations behind his eyes, weighing possibilities and risks with the speed of someone accustomed to making decisions under pressure. "The question now, Miss Mitchell, is whether you're actually worthy of the sacrifice your grandmother made, or if you're just a young woman playing dress-up in clothes that belong to a hero." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, but she recognized the challenge for what it was. This wasn't cruelty, it was a test. Eleanor's journal had prepared her for this, describing how her commanding officers had pushed her beyond what she thought were her limits, forcing her to discover strengths she never knew she possessed. "How do I prove myself worthy, sir?" Sarah asked, meeting his gaze without flinching. General Webb smiled for the first time since he had entered the room, but it wasn't a warm expression. It was the smile of a predator who had just spotted interesting prey. "You don't prove yourself to me, Miss Mitchell. You prove yourself to the mountain." An hour later, Sarah found herself in the back of a military jeep, driving up a winding road that seemed to climb straight into the clouds. General Webb sat beside her, consulting a tablet and making notes while the driver navigated switchbacks that would have terrified her under normal circumstances. Now, with adrenaline flooding her system and her grandmother's pin clutched tightly in her hand, she felt like she could face anything. The Jeep stopped at a facility that didn't appear on any maps. It was built into the mountainside itself, with most of the structure hidden underground and only a few unremarkable buildings visible from the outside. Sarah could see other vehicles parked nearby, black SUVs with tinted windows, and license plates she didn't recognize, motorcycles that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie, and what appeared to be a helicopter that was so advanced it seemed to bend light around its edges. "Welcome to Installation 7, General Webb," said as they walked toward the main building. "This facility doesn't exist in any official capacity, and nothing you see here today can ever be discussed with anyone who doesn't already know about it. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded, though she was beginning to wonder if she had gotten herself into something far more complex than she had imagined. The stories in her grandmother's journal had prepared her for secrecy and danger, but this felt like stepping into an entirely different world. The inside of the facility was a mixture of cutting-edge technology and military efficiency. Screens displayed information in languages Sarah didn't recognize, and personnel moved through the corridors with the quiet intensity of people who were always ready for emergency action. She noticed that everyone who saw General Webb immediately straightened their posture and offered subtle nods of respect, but they looked at her with undisguised curiosity. They entered a briefing room where 3 other people were waiting. The first was a woman in her 30s with short black hair and scars on her hands that suggested she had seen combat. The second was a man who looked like he could bench press a truck, with the kind of tan that came from spending years in desert environments. The third was younger, maybe Sarah's age, but his eyes held a wariness that made him seem decades older. "This is Captain Maria Santos, Sergeant First Class David Kim, and Specialist Jake Morrison," General Webb said by way of introduction. "They're going to be your evaluation team for the next 72 hours. Captain Santos stepped forward, and Sarah could immediately tell she was the type of person who didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Miss Mitchell, I've read your file, and frankly, I'm not impressed. You have no military experience, no combat training, and no special skills that we can identify. The only reason you're here is because of a piece of metal your dead grandmother left you." Sarah felt her temper flare, but she forced herself to respond calmly. "My grandmother earned that piece of metal by risking her life for her country. If you think that means nothing, then maybe you don't understand what real service looks like." Sergeant Kim laughed, but it wasn't a friendly sound. "Kid, your grandmother fought in a war where the biggest technology challenge was figuring out how to work a radio. The world has changed since then. Modern warfare requires skills she never dreamed of." Specialist Morrison, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up. "The question isn't whether your grandmother was a hero. The question is whether you have what it takes to be one in today's world, where the enemies are smarter, the weapons are deadlier, and the margin for error is basically zero." General Webb held up a hand to stop the conversation. "Enough. Miss Mitchell, these 3 are going to put you through a series of tests designed to evaluate every aspect of your potential as an operative. Physical fitness, mental acuity, emotional resilience, tactical thinking, and moral judgment. Some of these tests will push you to your breaking point. Others might break you entirely." He walked to the window and looked out at the mountains surrounding the facility. "I want you to understand something important. The Black Talon unit exists because there are threats in this world that conventional military forces can't handle. We deal with situations where failure doesn't just mean losing a battle. It means losing innocent lives or compromising national security in ways that could affect generations. The people we recruit don't just need to be good soldiers. They need to be exceptional human beings who can make impossible choices and live with the consequences." Sarah thought about her grandmother's journal entries, about the night Eleanor had to choose between saving a French resistance cell and maintaining her cover identity. Eleanor had chosen to save the resistance fighters, knowing it would mean months of additional danger for herself. That choice had probably saved hundreds of lives, but it had also meant Eleanor spent the rest of the war looking over her shoulder, never knowing if today would be the day her cover was finally blown. "I understand, sir," Sarah said. "I'm ready." Captain Santos smiled, and this time there was something genuinely predatory in the expression. "No, you're not. But that's okay. Nobody ever is." The first test began immediately. They led Sarah to a gymnasium that looked like it had been designed by someone who believed that physical fitness should be measured in terms of survival rather than athletic performance. Instead of normal exercise equipment, the room was filled with obstacle courses that seemed to change configuration every few minutes, rock climbing walls that extended up into darkness, and pools of water that appeared to be much deeper than they looked. Physical fitness baseline, Sergeant Kim explained, strapping what looked like a dozen different sensors to Sarah's arms, legs, and chest. We need to know what your body can do before we start pushing it past its limits. For the next 6 hours, Sarah ran, climbed, swam, and lifted until her muscles screamed for mercy. But every time she felt like she couldn't take another step, she thought about Eleanor parachuting into occupied France with nothing but her wits and a prayer. If her grandmother could do that, then Sarah could certainly handle whatever these people threw at her. When the physical testing finally ended, Sarah was exhausted, soaked with sweat, and covered in bruises she didn't remember getting. But she was still standing, and she could see something that might have been approval in Sergeant Kim's eyes. Not bad for a civilian, he admitted grudgingly. Your endurance is actually above average for military recruits, and your pain tolerance is higher than I expected. But physical fitness is only the beginning. The mental tests were worse than the physical ones. Specialist Morrison led her to a room filled with computers, maps, and screens displaying information that seemed to update faster than any human could possibly process. For hours, he threw scenarios at her that required her to make split-second decisions based on incomplete information. There's a terrorist cell planning to attack a school in downtown Denver, he would say, pulling up satellite images and intelligence reports. You have 3 possible locations where they might be hiding, but you only have resources to investigate one before they strike. Which do you choose and why? Sarah would analyze the available data, make her choice, and then discover that Morrison had been withholding crucial information that would have changed her decision entirely. The exercise was designed to be frustrating, to test whether she would second-guess herself or stick to her convictions when the pressure mounted. The point isn't to make the right choice, Morrison explained during a brief break. In the real world, you rarely have enough information to make the perfect decision. The point is to make a decision you can live with, and then execute it with complete commitment. Doubt gets people killed. The emotional resilience testing was the hardest part of all. Captain Santos led her to a small, windowless room with nothing but 2 chairs and a table. For what felt like hours, she asked Sarah questions that seemed designed to strip away every defense and expose every vulnerability. Tell me about your worst fear, Santos said, her voice deceptively gentle. Not spiders or heights or public speaking. Tell me about the thing that wakes you up at night in a cold sweat. Sarah tried to deflect at first, giving answers that sounded brave and patriotic. But Santos was relentless, picking apart every response until Sarah finally broke down and admitted the truth, that she was terrified of being ordinary, of living her entire life in Cedar Ridge without ever doing anything that mattered, of dying without ever knowing whether she could have been something more than just another person who was born, lived, and died without leaving any mark on the world. Good, Santos said when Sarah finished talking, tears streaming down her face. Fear of mediocrity is a better motivator than fear of death. Death is easy. It's over in a moment. Mediocrity is a slow poison that kills your soul one day at a time. By the time the 72 hours ended, Sarah felt like she had been taken apart and rebuilt from the ground up. She had been pushed further than she ever thought possible, forced to confront parts of herself that she had never acknowledged, and tested in ways that revealed strengths and weaknesses she never knew existed. General Webb found her in the facility's cafeteria at 3 a.m, staring into a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. She looked up when he sat down across from her, and he could see that something fundamental had changed in her expression. The eager young woman who had walked into the recruitment office had been replaced by someone harder, more focused, and infinitely more aware of the complexity of the world around her. "How do you feel?" he asked. Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. "Like I've been looking at my life through the wrong lens for the past 22 years. Like everything I thought I knew about myself was just the surface layer, and underneath there was this whole other person I never met before." General Webb nodded approvingly. That's exactly how Eleanor described it after her first week of training. She wrote in her reports that she felt like she had been living as a shadow of herself, and operational preparation had finally shown her what she was truly capable of becoming. He pulled out a folder and placed it on the table between them. "Your evaluation scores are in the top 5% of everyone we've ever tested. More importantly, you demonstrated the kind of moral flexibility and emotional resilience that can't be taught. Captain Santos, Sergeant Kim, and Specialist Morrison all recommended you for advancement to the next phase of evaluation." Sarah's heart leaped, but she tried to keep her voice steady. "What's the next phase?" General Webb's expression grew serious. "A real mission. Nothing too dangerous. We're not going to throw you into a combat zone on your first assignment. But it will be live operational work, with real consequences if you fail. Consider it your final exam." He stood up to leave, then paused and looked back at her. "Your grandmother will be proud, Miss Mitchell. But more importantly, I think you're finally ready to be proud of yourself." 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in a hotel room in downtown Portland, Oregon, looking out at the rain-soaked streets below and wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. The mission briefing had sounded straightforward enough when General Webb explained it back at Installation 7. A foreign agent had been selling classified information to the highest bidder, and they needed someone to get close to him and gather evidence of his activities. Someone young, inexperienced, and completely outside the normal intelligence community. Someone who couldn't be traced back to any government agency if things went wrong. "His name is Viktor Petrov," General Webb had explained, showing her photographs of a man in his early 40s with sharp features and expensive clothes. On the surface, he's a legitimate businessman who imports art and antiques from Eastern Europe. In reality, he's been operating as a freelance intelligence broker for the past decade, selling state secrets to anyone willing to pay his price. The photographs showed Petrov at gallery openings, charity events, and business meetings, always impeccably dressed and surrounded by the kind of people who appeared in society magazines. He looked like exactly the sort of man Sarah's small-town upbringing had never prepared her to deal with, sophisticated, worldly, and dangerous in ways that weren't immediately obvious. "What makes him so hard to catch?" Sarah had asked, studying the intelligence reports spread across the briefing table. Captain Santos had answered that question with the weary tone of someone who had been chasing shadows for years. "He's careful, smart, and paranoid. He changes his methods constantly, never uses the same contact twice, and has escape routes planned for every situation. More importantly, he has connections throughout law enforcement and intelligence agencies that keep him one step ahead of traditional investigations. But he has one weakness," Specialist Morrison had added, pulling up a different set of photographs on the screen. "He's attracted to young women who seem innocent but show potential for excitement. His psychological profile suggests he gets a thrill from corrupting people who appear pure. It's a compulsion he can't control, even though it puts him at risk." Sarah had felt a chill run down her spine as the implications became clear. "You want me to seduce him?" "We want you to become someone he wants to seduce," General Webb had corrected. "There's a difference. You'll be playing the role of a college student from small town who's fascinated by his world of international art and culture. Someone who seems naive enough to be manipulated, but clever enough to be interesting. The goal is to get him to trust you enough to let you into his inner circle, where you can gather the evidence we need to shut down his operation." Now, standing in that Portland hotel room, Sarah felt the weight of the mission pressing down on her like a physical force. She was wearing clothes that cost more than her father made in a month, a designer dress that Captain Santos had chosen because it was sophisticated enough to fit in at high-end social events, but still maintained an air of innocence that would appeal to Petrov's psychological profile. Her hair had been professionally styled, her makeup applied by an expert who understood how to enhance her natural features while making her look younger and more vulnerable than her 22 years. The transformation was so complete that she barely recognized herself in the mirror. The girl from Cedar Ridge was gone, replaced by someone who looked like she belonged in Petrov's world of gallery openings and champagne receptions. But underneath the designer clothes and professional makeup, Sarah could feel her grandmother's pin resting against her skin, a small reminder of the legacy she was carrying forward. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Gallery opening tonight. 7th and Morrison. He'll be there. Remember, you're an art student from Colorado, in town for a semester abroad program. Stay in character no matter what happens. Sarah took a deep breath and checked her appearance one final time. The innocent college student looking back at her from the mirror seemed convincing enough, but she wondered if Petrov would see through the act immediately. According to his file, he had been deceiving people professionally for over a decade. What made her think she could fool someone like that? The gallery opening was exactly what Sarah had expected. A room full of people who spoke in cultured voices about artistic movements she had never heard of, while servers circulated with wine that probably cost more per bottle than most people spent on groceries in a month. The artwork on the walls appeared to be a collection of modern pieces that Sarah couldn't begin to understand. But she had studied enough art history in the past 3 weeks to fake her way through basic conversations. She had been at the event for about 20 minutes, playing the role of slightly overwhelmed but eager student when she felt someone watching her. She turned around and found herself face-to-face with Viktor Petrov himself, looking exactly like his photographs, but somehow more imposing in person. His eyes were the pale blue of winter sky, and they seemed to take in every detail of her appearance in a single glance. "You look lost," he said, his accent adding an exotic edge to his words. First gallery opening. Sarah arranged her features into what she hoped was an appropriately flustered expression. "Is it that obvious? I'm actually an art student, but I've never been to anything this fancy before. I feel like everyone here knows something I don't." Petrov smiled, and Sarah could see immediately why he was successful at manipulating people. The smile was warm and inviting, designed to make her feel like the most interesting person in the room. The secret is that most of them don't know anything either. They're just better at pretending. "What kind of art do you study?" For the next hour, Sarah found herself drawn deeper into conversation with a man who was everything the intelligence reports had described and more. He was charming, cultured, and genuinely knowledgeable about art and history. He told stories about acquiring pieces from private collections across Europe, and he listened to her fabricated tales of small-town life with what seemed like genuine interest. But underneath the surface charm, Sarah could sense something else, a calculating intelligence that was constantly evaluating her responses, testing her reactions, and probing for weaknesses. This was a man who had built his career on reading people and exploiting their vulnerabilities, and she could feel him doing exactly that with her. "You're different from the other students I've met," he said as the evening wound down, his pale eyes fixed on her face. "There's something about you that suggests depths you haven't explored yet. Have you ever traveled outside of Colorado?" Sarah shook her head, maintaining the innocent persona while her mind raced. This was the opening she had been hoping for, the moment when Petrov would begin to reveal his true nature. "I've always wanted to see the world, but I've never had the opportunity. My family doesn't have much money, and I'm working my way through college." "How unfortunate," Petrov said, though his tone suggested he found her circumstances more interesting than unfortunate. "Someone with your potential shouldn't be limited by something as mundane as money. There are ways to see the world, experience culture, meet fascinating people, ways that don't require traditional resources." The offer hung in the air between them, and Sarah recognized it for what it was, the first step in a seduction that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with corruption. Petrov was beginning to test whether she might be willing to compromise her principles in exchange for the excitement and luxury he could offer. "What kind of ways?" she asked, allowing curiosity to creep in her voice. Petrov's smile widened, and, for just a moment, Sarah caught a glimpse of the predator behind the charming facade. "Perhaps we could discuss that over dinner tomorrow night. I know a place that serves the most extraordinary Russian cuisine, and the owner has stories that would fascinate someone with your interests in art and culture." Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she realized she was being invited into the next phase of whatever game Petrov was playing. This was what General Webb and his team had prepared her for, but now that the moment was actually happening, she felt the full weight of the danger she was walking into. "I'd like that very much," she said, hoping her voice sounded appropriately breathless with excitement rather than terror. The dinner the following night was held at a private club that existed behind an unmarked door in Portland's Pearl District. Sarah arrived to find Petrov waiting for her in a dining room that looked like something from a movie set. Dark wood paneling, crystal chandeliers, and artwork that she was beginning to suspect might not have been acquired through entirely legal means. Over courses of food she couldn't pronounce, but had to admit tasted incredible, Petrov began to reveal more about his world. He spoke about art collectors who would pay any price for pieces they couldn't obtain through traditional channels. He mentioned business associates in various European capitals who specialized in acquiring rare items for discerning clients. And gradually, carefully, he began to probe whether Sarah might be interested in earning some extra money by helping with certain specialized projects. "You have qualities that would be valuable in my line of work," he said over dessert, his pale eyes studying her face for reactions. "Intelligence, charm, and, most importantly, the kind of innocence that opens doors other people can't walk through. There are collectors who would pay handsomely for assistance in acquiring pieces they desire, and the work itself can be quite exciting." Sarah felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that her next words would determine whether she fell or learned to fly. "What kind of assistance?" Petrov leaned back in his chair, and Sarah could see him making the same calculations General Webb had made back at the recruitment office, weighing her potential against the risks of bringing her into his world. Sometimes collectors are interested in items that are held in private collections or museums or even government facilities. The owners of these items are often reluctant to part with them, regardless of price. In such cases, alternative methods of acquisition become necessary. The euphemisms were so elaborate that it took Sarah a moment to realize he was talking about theft. Not just theft, but the kind of sophisticated, high-stakes theft that required planning, connections, and skills that most criminals could never develop. This was the world her grandmother had infiltrated during World War II, updated for the modern age with better technology and higher stakes. "That sounds dangerous," she said, trying to project the right mixture of fear and fascination. "All the best things in life are dangerous," Petrov replied. "The question is whether you're brave enough to take risks when the rewards are extraordinary." Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah found herself drawn deeper into Petrov's organization. What had started as dinner conversations about art and culture gradually evolved into detailed discussions about specific operations he was planning. He introduced her to his associates, a network of specialists who could bypass security systems, forge documents, and move stolen goods across international borders without detection. The deeper she went, the more she realized how sophisticated the operation was. Petrov wasn't just a simple art thief. He was running a multinational criminal enterprise that dealt in everything from stolen masterpieces to classified government documents. His clients included private collectors, foreign intelligence agencies, and criminal organizations that would pay millions for the right information or artifacts. But more disturbing than the scope of his criminal activities was the gradual realization that Petrov was using the same techniques on her that he used on all his victims. Every conversation was designed to normalize criminal behavior, to make theft and espionage seemed like exciting adventures rather than serious crimes. Every gift he gave her, and there were many, each more expensive than the last, was intended to create a sense of obligation and complicity. Sarah found herself walking a tightrope between maintaining her cover and preserving her own moral integrity. She had to appear interested enough in Petrov's offers to maintain his trust, but not so interested that she actually became complicit in his crimes. The training at Installation 7 had prepared her for physical and mental challenges, but it hadn't fully prepared her for the psychological pressure of spending weeks pretending to be someone she wasn't while surrounded by people who made their living by exploiting others. The breakthrough came during her third week in Portland, when Petrov invited her to a private meeting at his warehouse facility on the outskirts of the city. The building looked unremarkable from the outside, just another industrial structure in a district full of shipping companies and storage facilities. But inside, Sarah found herself looking at what amounted to a high-tech criminal headquarters. The main floor was divided into different sections, each serving a specific function in Petrov's operation. There was a forgery studio where experts created fake documents and certificates of authenticity. There was a technology center where specialists hacked into security systems and government databases. And in the back, there was a climate-controlled storage area filled with items that Sarah was certain didn't belong to Petrov legally. "This is where the real work happens," Petrov explained, leading her through the facility with obvious pride. "What you see in the galleries and at the social events is just theater. This is where we actually acquire the pieces our clients desire." He stopped in front of a wall covered with photographs, maps, and detailed floor plans. Sarah realized she was looking at the planning materials for upcoming operations, government buildings, museums, and private residences that Petrov's organization was preparing to infiltrate. "We have a particularly interesting project coming up," Petrov said, pointing to blueprints of what appeared to be a federal building. "One of our clients is very interested in certain documents held by the Department of Defense. The information isn't particularly sensitive from a national security standpoint, but it would be extremely valuable to competitors in the defense contracting industry." Sarah's blood went cold as she realized what he was describing. This wasn't just art theft anymore. Petrov was talking about stealing classified government information and selling it to private companies. The kind of operation that could compromise military contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "How would something like that work?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady while her mind raced through the implications. Petrov smiled with the confidence of someone who had never been caught. "We have contacts inside the building, cleaning staff, security personnel, people who are paid to look the other way when necessary. The actual acquisition would be handled by specialists with the technical skills required for that kind of work. Your role would be simpler, but equally important." He turned to face her directly, and Sarah could see the predatory calculation in his pale eyes. "We need someone who can establish relationships with key personnel, someone who can gather intelligence about schedules, security procedures, and potential vulnerabilities. Someone young, attractive, and innocent enough to get close to people without arousing suspicion." The trap was finally revealing itself in all its sophisticated horror. Petrov hadn't been seducing her into his world as a romantic partner. He had been grooming her to become a spy for his criminal organization. All the expensive dinners, the gifts, the carefully crafted conversations about art and culture had been leading to this moment when he would ask her to betray her country for money. Sarah felt a surge of anger that she had to fight to control. This man had spent weeks manipulating her, playing on her supposed naivety and financial insecurity, assuming she could be bought like any other asset in his criminal portfolio. But underneath the anger, she felt something else, a cold, calculating fury that reminded her of the woman she had read about in her grandmother's journal. "What would be expected of me specifically?" she asked, allowing greed to creep into her voice. For the next hour, Petrov outlined a plan that was breathtaking in its audacity and terrifying in its potential consequences. Sarah would use her fake identity as a college student to apply for an internship program at the federal building. Once inside, she would gather information about security procedures, identify personnel who might be vulnerable to corruption or blackmail, and create opportunities for Petrov's technical specialists to access classified systems. The operation was scheduled to begin in 2 weeks, and Petrov estimated it would take about 3 months to gather all the information his client required. Sarah's compensation would be $50,000, more money than her family had ever seen, and exactly the kind of offer that might tempt someone in her supposed financial situation. "I need some time to think about this," Sarah said when Petrov finished his presentation, trying to project the right mixture of excitement and nervousness. Petrov nodded approvingly, as if her request for time was exactly what he had expected. "Of course, this is a significant decision, and I wouldn't want you to commit to something you weren't completely comfortable with. Take a few days to consider the possibilities." He walked her to the door of the warehouse, placing a hand on her shoulder that felt more possessive than protective. "I believe you have the potential to do extraordinary things, Sarah. The question is whether you're ready to step out of your small-town world and embrace the opportunities that await you." That night, Sarah sat in her hotel room and called the emergency contact number General Webb had given her. Within an hour, Captain Santos was at her door with a recording device and a team of technical specialists who began documenting everything Sarah had learned about Petrov's operation. "You've done exceptional work," Santos said after reviewing the intelligence Sarah had gathered. "We now have enough evidence to shut down his entire network and prosecute everyone involved. More importantly, we've identified the client who was trying to purchase classified defense information, which will allow us to prevent a much larger security breach." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion as she realized her mission was finally coming to an end. For 3 weeks, she had been living as someone else, surrounded by criminals who would have killed her without hesitation if they had discovered her true identity. The psychological pressure had been more intense than anything she had experienced during her training, and she was ready to return to her real life. But Captain Santos wasn't finished. "There's one more thing we need you to do. Petrov is expecting an answer about the federal building operation, and we need to maintain your cover long enough to identify all the personnel he's compromised inside the government. We want you to tell him you're interested. Then work with our technical team to feed him false information that will expose his contacts." Sarah stared at her in disbelief. "You want to go back? After everything I've learned about what he's capable of, I want you to finish the job your grandmother started," Santos replied quietly. Eleanor spent months behind enemy lines during World War II, knowing that discovery meant certain death. She did it because someone had to, and because she was the only person in the right position to gather the intelligence her country needed. "You're in the same situation now." Sarah thought about her grandmother's journal, about the entries where Eleanor described the constant fear and loneliness of living under a false identity while surrounded by people who wanted to kill her. But she also remembered the entries where Eleanor wrote about the satisfaction of knowing her sacrifices were protecting innocent people and serving a cause larger than herself. 2 days later, Sarah walked back into Petrov's warehouse and told him she was ready to accept his offer. Over the following month, she played the role of an eager accomplice while actually serving as a conduit for false information that led to the exposure and arrest of 12 government employees who had been selling classified information to foreign buyers. The operation concluded when federal agents raided Petrov's warehouse during what he thought was going to be a celebration of their successful infiltration of the Defense Department. Sarah watched from across the street as the man who had tried to corrupt her was led away in handcuffs, his sophisticated criminal empire collapsing around him like a house of cards. General Webb found her standing there in the rain, still wearing the expensive clothes Petrov had bought for her, but looking like someone who had aged years in the space of a few weeks. "How do you feel?" he asked, the same question he had posed after her training at Installation 7. Sarah considered the question carefully, thinking about everything she had learned about herself and the world during the past month. "Like I finally understand what my grandmother meant when she wrote about the cost of protecting people who will never know they were in danger. General Webb nodded approvingly. Welcome to Black Talon, Operative Mitchell. Your real training begins now. As they walked away from the scene of Petrov's arrest, Sarah felt her grandmother's pin warm against her skin, as if Eleanor's spirit was acknowledging that the promise made decades ago had finally been fulfilled. The girl from Cedar Ridge was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that the most important battles were fought in shadows by people whose names would never appear in history books. But, unlike her grandmother, Sarah wouldn't have to carry her secrets alone. She was part of something larger now, an organization dedicated to protecting innocent people from threats they would never see coming. And somewhere in the mountains of Colorado, in a facility that didn't officially exist, other young men and women were being tested and trained to carry on the same tradition of silent service. The story that began with laughter in a recruitment office had become something far more significant. A bridge between generations of people who understood that freedom wasn't free and that someone always had to pay the price to keep the darkness at bay.